Good morning. And for those of you that are Auburn people, forgive me for saying the usual Auburn greeting, War Eagle. Yeah. We love you anyway. That's okay. I'm Steve Taylor. I'm the Senior Vice President for Research and Economic Development here at Auburn. And I just want to issue a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of our President, Dr. Chris Roberts. Both of us are very happy that you're here. It's really great to see the audience in this room. I know there are other rooms and then those of you online. So it's really great to see you here. I can't really think of a more timely and more important topic for educators to get together and talk about today. You know, if you think about each of you pull out your phone, look in your whatever news app is your favorite one, the topics of today, they're going to be hurricane, the solar storm last day or two, the election coming up, global conflict, sustainability, maybe all those topics. This one probably is more important, more timely than all of those for our future, I think. And the interesting thing, when you think about each one of those topics, the hurricane, solar storm, elections, global conflict, when you stop and think about that for a minute, every one of those, today, AI is a major part of each of those stories. The models that we're running to predict where the hurricane track goes, we know AI is behind those models. The solar storm, I'm sure AI, machine learning is in there somewhere. How do we predict the impact of that? We know our elections, we know AI is an issue there, both good and bad, of how AI is influencing our elections. Global conflict, we know we're targeting things now using AI and machine learning. So all of those topics that are contemporary, really when you back away from them, AI is connected to each one of those. And so as we go forward, particularly as educators, we're going to be working with students and training our students, training ourselves, learning how to use AI, machine learning, all these topics in a way that's, I guess the question I would ask myself is, I'm an engineer, so we're always asking, can we use this tool to solve this problem? And then there's a second question of, should we do that? Should we really use it from a safety standpoint, a cost standpoint, a sustainability standpoint, ethical? All those concerns are really, should we do that? And then if you get to the point, yes, we should, then there's how do we do that? And so when you think about in an education context, can we use these tools in our classroom, in our outreach programs? And then, should we do that? Again, tick off all those things: ethics, safety, cost, sustainability. Is it okay to use that much electrical power to answer this question? And then finally, how do we do that? How do we do it in a safe, ethical, efficient way? So I know that's part of what you're here for, to really talk about that. And I'm just really pleased that you're here at Auburn. I appreciate our leadership at Auburn for sponsoring this, and hope you have a great day. I know some of you have been here yesterday, but hope you have a great day here today, and really advance a great topic. I'll finish with a little silly story. Some of you may have heard this. My daughter lives in Los Angeles. We were just talking a second ago. My daughter lives in LA. A few months ago, I was visiting her, and we were scooting around just across town, going back and forth across LA. And she, in her car, she would say, "Siri, help me find this," or "Where's this?" And every time Siri would answer her, she would say, "Thank you, Siri." And I looked over the first time and gave her kind of a funny look, and she looked at me and she goes, "Oh, I make it a point to be polite to every AI thing that I interact with, because when the machines take over, I want them to remember that I was nice to them." So I'm just telling you, I thought it was funny at first, and the more I think about it, I think she's right. I think she has a point. So I hope you're here today to figure out how to make things work and do things, as we talked about, safely, ethically, sustainably. But how do we educate our kids? How do we educate those in our outreach programs? All of those. I know you're going to have a productive day. So thank you all for being here. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jim Purcell.
Well, welcome. I think the big thing for those of us that are bureaucrat is we just sort of want to know how much cost and when do you need it. And I think that's a big question. A lot of it is scalability, and a lot of it is how do we do it quickly. And hopefully all of you that are the experts in the world can give us some guidance on that. It's all new to us, you know, and especially those of us that work with elected officials and stuff. They just really want the quick answer. They want it to happen. They want Alabama to be at the lead for that. And those, how many of you are from outside of the state? Okay, well, we got a couple of them that came in, want to see what we got going. That's good. That's, you know, one of the most important things is, you know, it's going to take a village to make this happen, but we don't know who the villagers are that have the capabilities. And then the hard thing is for universities, it's scalability, really. You know, how much of a state investment is going to be required to really make this happen? And that's an important question that we need to ask, and we need to continue to ask for the next few years. So make that happen. Now, y'all talked about Auburn and Alabama. I do want to declare that I am an Auburn graduate. Everybody happy?
We're Eagle.
But I'm also an Alabama graduate. And so what I do is I tell my Auburn friends that Auburn was the love of my life. I wanted to go here. My family went here and everything. But then I tell my Alabama friends, please forgive me. That was a childhood indiscretion. So with that, I'd like to have Asim come forward and sort of talk about our events today and sort of set up really our speaker who's going to, I think, really help set the stage for the conversation that all of us need to have. And I'm glad all of you are here to be a part of that. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Asim Ali. I'm the Executive Director of the Biggio Center. And it's a pleasure to have all of you on our campus today, and those of you joining in virtually as well. So I have the pleasure of first, I'm going to do a few things. First, I have the pleasure of gratitude. There are a few folks that I want to make sure that we are able to appropriately thank. And then I'll introduce our opening keynote speaker, and then we'll do a chat with the opening keynote speaker as well. And then we'll share some information for the rest of the day. Sound like a good plan? Great. So first, I want to thank our colleagues at the Alabama Commission for Higher Education. I see Dr. Jim Purcell and Dr. Robin McGill and all of your team have been just incredible to work with. Thank you so much for several months now putting this event together. I want to recognize several of our sponsors who've been so instrumental. For those of you that are working in the state of Alabama and being able to attend this conference for no charge, those of you that are connected virtually, being able to attend for no charge, that's largely because of our just generous donors that have been a part of this process. I want to start with NVIDIA, Mr. Lewis Stewart, and Mark West and Danny DeVito, who've been great to work with. And these are folks that are available to any higher education institution. So I hope you'll connect with them as well, because even though they love Auburn, they are willing to work with you as well if you're not from Auburn. Microsoft, Stephanie Stevens and Bill Bales have been just incredible and continuously partnering with us and providing resources for our faculty, staff, and students. I really want to thank Andrew Schultz from AUBIX. You know, AUBIX is a local data center, and if you think about it from a functional perspective, your devices are connecting into the data center so they can access the world. And I got to tell you, that's really what the role that Andrew's played in putting this, helping us put this event together. He's really been a tremendous supporter and a generous supporter, as well as a great partner in connecting us with several others, such as the Alabama AI Center for Excellence. Infina is here, Core Scientific, and the I-85 Cyber Corridor. All of those are just tremendous. These are folks that are right in our backyard that are interested in making sure that the work that you're doing in the classroom is being advanced in the best way possible, but then also hiring the students that you're helping graduate, and that becomes an important relationship. Mainstay and then Quant Hub is also here. I want to thank Google and then Dr. Stephen Taylor with Auburn Research, as well as our provost office with Provost Vinnie Nathan, just continually being available to help support our crazy ideas. There are two important teams that have helped put together today's event. That's the Biggio Center, as well as the AI at AU Education Committee. And if you're on that, I'd like for you to raise your hand. If you're in the Biggio Center, I know several of the folks are outside still doing work. Among those groups, I would be remiss not to thank our very own Tinkerbell, Nikki Schubert, who's really been the magic in putting the event together. So, For those of you that that get the pleasure of working with productive teams, if you've got somebody on your team that you can dream it and they make it happen, and that's really a pleasure to work with these teams. With that said, also the AI at AU initiative overseen by Dr. Hari Narayanan and then Dr. Jerry Dozier I saw earlier is also here. Both of them have done a tremendous job of collaboration and connection across campus. I also want to thank our partners from Southern Union State Community College, as well as Auburn University Montgomery, who have been very good partners in helping us put together today's event. So I want to share with you that kind of making a little shift. I've got you were mentioning your daughter driving. I've got a 16-year-old, and my fellow Alabamians know that over the last year in our house, we've been teaching him how to drive. It always starts with reading a book, a manual, observing others driving, and that kind of builds up your skills a little bit. But until you get behind that wheel, you really don't appreciate both the positive as well as the potential damage that can be done by what you have access to. And of course, for parents, that's always the nerve-wracking part. But AI is much the same way. Until you sit in the driver's seat and have that moment to yourself to realize that you have access to a tool or a vehicle that it's possible to do incredible things with, but it's also possible to do terrible things with. Until we have that experience, we're not able to understand truly what's possible. And so today, I also want to do a little PBS moment and thank you for being here and being engaged. It's important for our state, and it's important for the students that we're working with that we do this. And an important part of that is continually learning, continually finding ways to continually upskill what we're capable of doing. You certainly know that the Biggio Center is a partner for you in that endeavor, but everyone who's attending today is a partner for you in that endeavor as well. And we're fortunate to have a speaker who's going to share with us some thoughts around some just the responsibility that we have, but also the possibilities that we have. So those of you like me may have grown up reading like Macworld or PC World. Maybe you saw a CEO of a company launch their mega amazing product on a stage in the 90s or so. That was done behind the scenes of that was a company named IDG, which was founded by Patrick McGovern. And after he passed away, all of the assets were turned over into a Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. And our speaker today is the president of that foundation, and they've been able to, through various movements, be able to create a multi-billion-dollar foundation that is endeavoring to support workforce development, ethical AI, responsible AI, and access. And I'm really excited about hearing from his world experience. Over the past few months, when we've gotten a chance to connect, Vilas, I've found is a tireless advocate for everyone to have the best of access to the most emerging technologies, but also understanding the workforce and the economic development aspect of that, and also the responsible and ethical aspect of that to make sure that humans understand that value. And it's also that whenever I meet with him, he's usually about to get on a plane to go off to an amazing location. So today, thank you for being at this amazing location, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. Vilas?
Thank you, Asim.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I am so delighted to be here. I have to tell you, amazing locations. This is one of the best. I snuck out last night after the reception to go get some secret barbecue, and I loved it. So I'm delighted to be here in Auburn. I have to say thank you to all of you, to Auburn University for hosting, to the Alabama Higher Education Commission, to each one of you for this incredible warm welcome to the great state of Alabama. I'm delighted to be here. I'm struck by the fact that we are in a moment now where it's so easy to be taken up by the tooling of AI, by the short-term opportunities, by the ways we want to integrate it. And yet I think there's a more profound moment that we are all in the middle of, and I want to make sure we take a moment to acknowledge it. This isn't merely about how we integrate AI into our institutions to drive efficiency or to do things a little bit better. It's a moment of transformative change. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I often get to talk about AI, and I'll tell you, I've spent 2.5 decades working in technology, being an entrepreneur, being a scholar. I believe deeply with great optimism about what tools and technologies can do for us. But the point of the conversation is never what AI lets us do. It's what we choose to do when we have the enablement of AI. I think of AI often as a Trojan horse, to go back to my classical training. It's a piece that in a hype cycle where everybody wants to talk about AI all the time, lets us start with a conversation about how we might use these tools, how we might learn from them, how we might do more with them, but very quickly change a conversation into how we participate in the benefits of AI, about how we build a society where AI's benefits are equitably distributed, where we get to talk about dignity and identity and participation, what it means for us to find jobs of purpose, what it means for us to have political participation, how we make sure that we have access to healthcare. The fact that conversations about AI lead us to the foundational constructs of what our society is built on, and also give us a moment in time to test the assumptions behind those constructs. To say, if we once lived in a world where healthcare was limited in access because it was so expensive, if AI lets us change the foundational cost curve of healthcare, do we still want to say that we live in a society where healthcare is only available to the few? Or do we want to go back to our core constructions of what a liberal democracy looks like, of what America looks like, and say it's time for us to have a new construction of a universal access? This is the opportunity that's in front of us. And it's important to ground ourselves in that moment, even as we do the work of figuring out how to use AI, that we're also guided by a vision of what's possible. With your indulgence, I'd love to take a few minutes and just share with you 3 thoughts that I think are coherent, that are part of the public conversation, and yet sometimes don't always get as much airtime as they should, as we are with breathless anticipation waiting for the next AI model to roll out. And the first is this. I think as I travel around the country and talk to communities just like this one, there is a starting narrative that's quite seductive. The idea that we have technical capacity that's being held in a few faraway places that are creating the tools that will allow us to do what we do. Whether it's Silicon Valley or it's a small set of private companies, that AI innovation's being created there and we are going to use it. I am against this narrative with every fiber of my being, and I'm validated in that because of the conversations I get to have with every single one of you. Look, the tools will be created. They might be created in supercompute centers where concentrations of scientists are building them, but the tools will be used in communities like this one. And when I say used, I mean they will be adapted, they will be developed, and eventually they will be built inside of communities. And if we can start from a fundamental reconception of the conversation to say that AI development isn't something that happens far away, but is something that we own, we get to restructure a brand new conversation. It's a conversation that centers around a few ideas. One, the fact that no matter what abstractions are created in AI models, when they're used in communities, they need to be used in ways that reflect the experiences and shared narratives of the people who live in them. As I stand here in Alabama and I think about AI use cases, I think naturally about higher education, the conversation we're here for. I think about agriculture. I think about industrialization and mechanization. I think about access to healthcare through the constructs of the local challenges and the local opportunities of the people in these communities. And I realize that if we want to build solutions that advance their interests, they have to be built here. They have to be built in academic centers and research institutions that recognize the development of these problems, that understand where they come from, that understand the economic and the social and the political factors that drove the systemic inequities that created the problem, and figure out how to apply machine learning and data science and these wonderful new tools in ways that reflect the core interests of the communities we live in. I think about the fact that your responsibility as leaders in this room is to train a generation of people who aren't merely learning these skills to go out and get jobs, but are rather becoming masters of the domain so that they can become the leaders of AI through the next generation of development. That the investment in training and skilling here has to move beyond what do the tools let us do today to recognizing the ownership of the architecture of the tools of tomorrow, where we can balance the interactions that we have in training and public skilling programs and credentials with long-term investment in the individual pathways of those individuals so that they're able to get those skills and training in ways that are sovereign to them, that they can take between employers, that they can come back to academia when they want to, and they can go to the private sector and build the kinds of tools that actually create that future for all of us. And I want to talk about the fact that as a matter of local ownership of AI, we get to an amazing conversation about collaboration. And it brings me to today's conversation that you have convened here today. And I want to reflect on 2 versions of that story. The first, that often when I speak with groups like this around the country, they're eager to tell me about the successes and failures that they've had in deploying AI in their institutions individually. And there's a space for shared commiseration. that sometimes what we do is actually a shared experience, that the ways we might have tried to implement an ethical AI policy that might have foundered against a certain set of interests in one institution is actually reflected across multiples. I think there's great value in the sharing of best practices. But there's something unique about the moment of deployment of AI that I think we need to keep in mind, that even as we as individual institutions try to deploy it, we're constricted by a world where investments in AI require massive resources, whether it's in the form of building technical capacity or in the form of building the administrative and regulatory responses to it. And I wonder if there's an alternate model that you all maybe are already pioneering or could, where instead of thinking about it as sharing the successes and failures of individual institutions, we proactively begin to design the mechanisms of using AI that actually bring institutions together in shared experimentation. That instead of coming here to talk about what we have done that has failed or succeeded, we come together to plan what we will do together. I think about the allocation of compute in building educational systems and building algorithmic design programs. What if we could actually create new forms of collaboration and partnership, which again, I think many in this room are leading on, that let us say, let's build shared resources, let's build shared libraries of educational and pedagogical materials, and then let's experiment them in each of our individual institutions in ways that let us do A/B testing, that let us actually structure multiple defined approaches to say, let's try together to figure out what works best. I think this idea of collaboration is something that is still being defined. But as we see the participation of particularly some of the private companies that are represented in this room, and I hear about the incredible partnerships that they're building with single institutions, I'm struck by the fact that there's an opportunity here to actually build a consortium of private sector providers, a consortium of institutions on the other side, and build platform-based ways for them to interact. To say, let's actually bring hardware, chips and compute, algorithmic support, engineering and technical capacity, with the incredible research and pedagogical institutional support that's held inside of your organizations to build a statewide process around how we do AI at scale. I want to share with you one last thought, and then I know that we'll go into a Q&A. But this one takes us a little bit out of the day-to-day. Too often, I think that as I talk to boards and CEOs, organizations across the world, we are immediately inspired by short-term wins, by the ways we might use AI to think about how we improve the classroom experience in the short term, how we might use tools like large language models to change the way we assign or evaluate educational pathways. And yet, I think that we are often too concerned with how we do the things that we do today better. We don't necessarily spend enough time thinking about how we do better things. What I mean by this is to think about these tools as a pathway to have a conversation, not just about changing our practices, but about a foundational idea of what educational transformation might look like, of how we inspire an entirely new form of pedagogy, one that restructures the dignity of the individual, the agency of the individual in their learning pathways, and re-examines even how we think about the core conceptions of what classrooms look like. You know, I've been a student far too many times through too many different degrees. I've been a professor on the other side of it. And I've seen how even over the last 25 years, the interaction in the classroom has changed because of the leadership I think that many of you have shown in innovating. And yet I also wonder, as we think about new tools like personalized tutoring, about creating engagement with students through entire learning journeys, through integration between learning and employment records, how we might actually reconceptualize what the moment in time is for AI to change how we think not just of the student, but of what we think of as the role of educational institutions in building a digitally literate and educated, emphatically involved class of people who believe in creating our future. This is a small set of thoughts I'd love to share with you. I know that we're going to have a Q&A, and I look forward to your questions as well. But let me just end with this. I come here, I was at the White House just a couple of days ago working with civil society and philanthropic and educational institutions on new ways of conceptualizing what AI policy might look like in the US government. And I was deeply inspired because what I heard over and over again was, first, as always, a deep sense of, let's not call it fear, but let's call it caution about how these AI tools might be deployed in ways that might not necessarily lead to our best outcomes, but maybe some of our worst. But through a conversation, I think I consistently see we go from fears, which I think this room has already stepped through and beyond, to a sense that we have an incredible moment in time where we have an agency to think about how AI might help us realize our best visions of a future. That vision will be enabled by technology companies and by the students that we all train, but they'll be directed by the decisions that we make today. That'll change how AI is deployed, the principles and practices, the responsible frameworks, the ethical deployment considerations that we build. It'll be directed by the ways that our students take those lessons and apply them across myriad use cases, in applying AI in their jobs, potentially even in the ways that they bring it into their homes and into their political frameworks. And it's a moment of extreme possibility. I want to thank you all for the incredible work you do. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'm looking forward to learning from you all today. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. I think that's a lot. Thanks so much for those thoughts. I think I first want to start with, I had a recent opportunity to visit Jasper, Alabama, a small town in Northwest Alabama. And recently I was also in Sylacauga, Alabama. In a few weeks, I'll be in South Alabama. When I drive to these rural communities, I see the interest is tremendous and sky high. What, for the educators in this room, the academic institutions in this room, when you say that the responsibility and the opportunity, what are some of those things that educators should absolutely be focusing on in terms of the skills? From your vantage point, what are those key skills that are really needing to be focused on to make sure that we're meeting those needs?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think two things that I want to say about this. One is I've spent a lot of time in small towns across America over the last few years. And what I consistently see is exactly what you've talked about. There is a lot of interest, often coupled with excitement and hope, sometimes coupled with caution. But we want to acknowledge and recognize that interest doesn't equate to access. That in many of these communities still to this day, we're still faced with basic inequities and the idea of even access to a digital ecosystem. And I think the question that we need to focus on as educators is how do we make sure that students that are coming out of those communities, not by the time they're ready for a college or a 2-year or a certification, but at the time that they're in grade school, are getting access to the same kind of basic digital literacy that lets them feel the kind of agency that I know you and I aspire for the entire world to feel. I think that has to be a starting point. And this again goes back to the fundamental conception that for 2 centuries in America, academic centers were a place that you went to be trained in meaningful ways. And yet, as we enter into the 21st century, there's a requirement for academic centers to move into a very much a different perspective, one that leans into and out into communities. The things about bringing education, not merely through traditional channels, but digital and non-traditional channels to those communities where they are. I think that's point one. The second is you ask about skills. And I think here too, we continue to see this opportunity gap that is emerging. We used to talk about a digital divide. I think unfortunately, we now think about an AI chasm, a world where that split conditioned by socio-political, economic, and racial factors is widening faster than we ever expected. So when I think about skills, I don't think about, can you use the newest LLM or do you know how to do prompt engineering? I think these are highly tactical interventions that have a place, but they're not systemic and structural transformations that lead to equity. Instead, we need to be thinking about, do you have the basic environment in which you have the comfort and the capacity to go out and engage a digital world? Let's start there. Let's think about, even before we touch a single computer, have we built and invested enough in building social comfort and capacity that every kid in America feels like they could be a part of going online? The second is to think about access. And the third is to then think about a basic engagement with the idea that I want to break this narrative that somebody else builds technology for us. And if we were able to change the narrative, I think then you'd see an organic growth of the kinds of capacity and skills development programs in these communities where every kid would feel like they had a chance.
Yeah, that's a really good one. When I was growing up using the internet, the World Wide Web was just starting out. And I remember thinking about, how do I not just be a user of this? How do I actually create things for it? So along those lines, it seems like the hurdle, the skills for developing some of these most emerging technologies are becoming even more and more technical or even more and more required. And so that's why it does seem like that all of the innovation is happening in these closed environments, which is opposed to what we used to see in terms of the most innovative work happening from federally funded research instead. What are, you mentioned an interesting point in terms of the role of nonprofit organizations and philanthropic organizations. What do you envision, in terms of maybe of the next decade? Where do you see the McGovern Foundation and other philanthropic organizations like that? If we think about where AI should be headed from your perspective, what role do those organizations play in that?
It's a great question. Just a few weeks ago, I spent a very significant amount of time with some of the most prominent kind of AI faces, right? The ones that you would recognize as leading the top companies. And I was just so struck by the one-dimensional nature of the conversation. What they wanted to talk about was, we're going to build the next model, the most powerful model. We're going to bring in more data. We're going to put more power against them. We're going to restart old power facilities. We're going to keep going. And yet, as I work with communities to think about how we use AI to solve local problems, the kinds of problems that people are facing that need solutions don't need that next set of models. We actually need to figure out how we take the innovation that we already have and apply it in ways that matter. Let me give you a few examples. I worked with a community recently who is facing significant local climate impacts. And in the context of this very rural community, it's about mudslides. They live in an area that's prone to mudslides. Mudslides, as you well know, are things that are actually quite hard to predict. They come so quickly and they devastate communities and they kill people. The solution for many, many years was, anytime anything happened, they would leave their village. And in so doing, they'd leave crops and often would lose an entire harvest and many other things. We worked with a local university to build a set of low-cost IoT sensors that were deployed all the way in the hills around the village. And using a pretty basic machine learning model, we're able to build a predictive tool that gives them 15 minutes of notice. We hooked it into a set of alarms around the village. And just in the last year, we've seen that set of alarms activate 4 or 5 times, and in doing so, probably save at least a few lives. It's the most low-cost, low-energy intervention using AI that, for the people in that village and now in villages across the region, is transforming their capacity to live their lives with basic dignity and safety and security. These stories abound. I could give you hundreds or thousands of use cases like this around the world, where what we think of as AI is being used today to change people's lives, from rural subsistence farmers who are understanding how to use these tools to increase their harvest and enter markets, to frontline health workers who are using predictive tools on top of LLMs to deliver better health care than people have ever experienced. So what do we take from these stories? This sense of exceptionalism that comes from, we'll build the newest and best tech, is becoming quickly decoupled from where we need to be investing to build the AI use cases that transform lives today. And here we come to your question: what are the roles then of all of the traditional institutions of society that should be stepping into that breach? Academic institutions that are driving with incredible research local interventions of those amazing technologies to solve local problems. And for me, I think nonprofits and civil society. Organizations that often partner with these communities at their points of critical vulnerability, that understand problems incredibly well, that often have access to incredible data stores, who have traditionally been about as far away from technological innovation as you can get. And that's changing, and it's changing fast. We're seeing nonprofits come forward and say, we want to figure out how to use these tools. And in so doing, as I said earlier, they don't just use them, they transform them, they adapt them, they build on top of them, and they create an entirely new typography of technology. I think that's the world we should be most inspired by.
Yeah, that's really great. So sometimes in that context, we see the cart before the horse challenge, which is, well, you need the talented people in order to educate the people to have the skills, which will then bring in the employers who need those talented skills. But sometimes those employers are not coming until that talent base exists. Particularly if I think about the state of Alabama. Earlier we were having some conversations around how providing computer science education, for example, is very challenging in some of the rural areas because the talent that's needed to teach those skills may not be readily available. Any thoughts around, like, what advice would you have for those that are doing economic development work in Alabama? How do we kind of deal with that challenge?
Yeah. We're seeing two things happening across the country, and they're both mildly controversial, but let's talk about them. The first is this idea of a transformation of pedagogical approach, right? From teacher and classroom to really think about how we push educational learning to make it available to communities where they are. We've gone through one round of that, which has been digital education and online courses. We've seen mixed forms of efficacy coming out of them. But the new extension now is AI-based agents or models who can do personalized training and support. And I think there's a real potential here because the delivery mechanism for that often can be on phones, right? So it doesn't require the same kind of digital infrastructure inside of last mile communities. I think we are right at the cusp of beginning to establish the efficacy of these interventions. And I think there is an existential question that's coming for educational institutions to say, is this something where we lean in and support and build these tools? Or do we step back and let private sector organizations create them and license content? I think that is something that every institution in this room needs to be thinking about. And I think there's a space for early movers to actually be able to own not just the delivery of content, but the underlying pedagogical philosophy that goes with it. And I would really welcome that. So that's the first. The second is, again, this idea of what are the frontline champions for these kinds of technologically driven social change, right? When you talk about communities where you're having a hard time finding talent that can go out and speak to them, I think not about deploying more teachers, although I'd love to see that happen across America, right? But also, how do we repurpose existing leaders in those communities to become ones who can talk about and understand how these tools actually change the ways that they engage? Whether it's faith-based leaders, nonprofit leaders, or community leaders, to actually empower them in a train the trainer type model, to say, here are skills that can be delivered that you can then curate in your communities. I've seen community centers around the country bring together small cohorts of interested individuals and say, let's do a basic training so that we can share with you, not even getting to the idea of employment-based skilling, but let's actually acknowledge that many of us to this day still aren't even using the commercially available kind of frontline AI tools. Let's start with just basic community literacy around these tools and then say, how do we take from that the individuals who are most enthusiastic and committed, train them in ways that let them become spokespeople in their communities?
Yeah, that's thanks for those thoughts. So just a quick note for those of you that are in here, you know, if you have questions, I'm looking at my Biggio technology folks. We're going to create a way for you to be able to ask those questions in just a moment. And then for those of you that are in the virtual world, if you put your question in the chat, then even if we don't get to your question in the live session, we'll make sure that that we document those questions and make and share out that information later on as well. So, you know, it does feel like there's that fear of I don't know where the boundaries should be or what the guardrails should be. Any thoughts around, from your vantage point, of how, from two questions really, like how do we as educators, maybe from the more direct responsibility, but also as policymakers, those, you know, that may be listening in, how do we make sure that that's not holding us up from starting, but also from your vantage point, what are those boundaries? What would feel like it's gone too far?
It's a great question. I had a wonderful conversation last night with somebody who's in this room who shared with me her journey of building an ethical and responsible AI use policy in the classroom. And I was just very impressed. If you're in the room, raise your hand. But 7 weeks from start to finish, it was an incredible conversation that demonstrated this capacity in the middle of so much interest to drive outcomes. And I want to acknowledge you because that's an incredible story. Look, we're starting from the right place, right? Which is, we need to build policies not around the technology itself, but around how we acknowledge its use, how we actually create boundaries around what's acceptable and not. Too often, and in other communities, I hear the starting point of, well, how do we build more ethical technology? And I just want to share with you all that I think that's absolutely the wrong starting point. There is no such thing as an ethical technology. Ethics is a human function. We build ethical use by redefining how we as people come together to acknowledge what kind of outcome we're trying to create and the boundaries and conditions in which we want to allow that to happen. I want us to own that, particularly in this room, because each of you are leaders in an organization where you will be defining it not just for your institution, but through your pedagogy, training an entire set of emerging leaders to take those responsibilities on as well. So I want to start there. The first thing we need to acknowledge is we are really thinking about the ethical outcomes of the implementations of these technologies. And those are social functions that we need to build robust mechanisms around. The second is there is no reason why that should be happening institution by institution. That if I can think of a particularly fertile place for collaboration, this is it. Rooms like this that can set common standards and outcomes, that can also ensure that we're not recreating the wheel every time we enter into a new issue, and build standards that actually allow Alabama to be a model for the country. I think there's an incredible possibility in that. And the final thing I'll say to you is this can never be a set it and forget it kind of outcome. We can't build ethical policies around the use of AI today and say, we've got it covered for the next 5 years, let's move on. So I think one of the exhortations I'd make to this room is to really think about what are the kinds of institutional changes you need to allow you to have accountability for someone or some group of people who are constantly monitoring what's happening around the world, but in your own institutions, where are the new boundary conditions that are emerging, where with the common sense that I think we all have, we look at an outcome and say, there's something about that that doesn't sit right. Now let's go back into an analytical framework and figure out how we address it going forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I work with organizations, they always ask, what kind of AI policy should we have? And I say, it's too early to have, mostly your existing policies are probably fine. The real challenge is going to come when we don't have the policies for what AI is newly capable of doing. And so it's an opportunity to build a capacity for knowing how to get policies approved and edited and amended. And, sometimes we struggle with those processes. So that's an important aspect of it as well. One of the things the McGovern Foundation focuses on is this idea of, how data should be just available and not particularly siloed or owned by private organizations. Can you talk about the role that data plays in what we're doing and what organizations can be doing right now in terms of the data?
The data. We have a critical set of challenges around data. The first is an obvious one. For decades, really centuries, I can go back to censuses from the 19th century, we have collected data with a certain intentionality. Often that intentionality is around commercial purpose. We collect lots of data about the things that maybe drive profit or drive kind of meaningful political outcomes. But there are many, many people, communities, entire institutions that aren't represented in those data sets simply because they've never had a profit-based motivation to be there. And as we begin to think about how we turn AI into a set of tools that actually advance the public welfare at scale, we have to go back and clear that data gap. Now, how do we do that? Well, when I think about things like the fact that Indigenous people are underrepresented across the board on pharmaceutical drug testing data, or that institutions that are often in poor areas have much less granularity of data than others, I see two possible ways that we might address it. The first is having institutions like the ones represented in this room step forward as new curators of data with potentially funding from government or from philanthropy to say that we're going to make a commitment to ensuring that the data sets that drive the training of new models are actually representative of communities and individuals in ways that actually foster a broad sense of equity, but also with an economic input in mind, right? That if we really want to build models that are effective at predicting outcomes for everybody, then they need to be trained on data that reflects those individuals. I think the second part of that then is we need to think about what kind of institutions in society are the curators and stewards of data. Today, what we see is this incredibly fragmented patchwork. Every institution has its own data set, governed both by privacy regulation, but also by, I think, a strong sense of ownership and ego. Many institutions that just don't want to train data, that even if they're not driving a meaningful economic outcome in the short term, they're worried that giving it up might limit them in the future. I think what this means is we need to ideate new ways of thinking about governance, of shared economic participation, to say, are there institutions we could build that could be data stewards at scale? This doesn't mean that everybody would have to give up their data, and I'll give you an example in the climate space, an organization called Climate Trace that's absolutely incredible. And you can go to their website, climatetrace.org, and I'll tell you what they've done. They built a global database that allows you to understand carbon and methane emissions in super granular detail. We could go online right now, we could pull up Auburn, Alabama, and we could say, show us who are all of the sources of emissions of carbon and methane. The way that they've been able to create that is not to build one global repository, but rather to coordinate with hundreds of organizations across the world that contribute parts of their data sets in ways that allow Climate Trace to run these analytics and run predictive models on top of them. We could think about analogs for that across so many different issues, from educational outcomes to economic participation, and say, could we foster a set of new institutions that play this role?
Yeah, that's fantastic. So maybe let's take one, possibly two questions from the audience. If you have a question, so the microphones in this room are set up such that you can project your voice and both virtual attendees as well as those in here can hear it. So allow me to call on you if anybody's got a question. Yes, sir. If you could introduce yourself as well.
Jeff Buller from Auburn University. One of the things I've wondered about, and you kind of addressed some of the topics, is the business model for higher education hasn't really changed since the land-grant institutions were coming out. And that's one of the things that maybe holds us back from transformation. I agree with the outcomes, but how do we get there? What's the change that's going to require? But accounting, we charge by the semester because financial aid is on the semester, because scholarships and grants and all that stuff has to have been accounting. And because of that, we can't change one spot. It's almost like we need national level leadership just to engender a flexible way of accounting for what it is, because we do still have to pay for things, pay for professors, pay for institutions. So what are your ideas about that? And thank you for all the ideas like AI is built and used here. I love that. But how do we make that happen nationally in higher education?
Yeah. So just to repeat, the question was around the business model of higher education. How do we make sure it's adapting to the changing economy?
Yeah. I mean, I know you think a lot about this too, so I'll invite you to come into the question. I wish I had the magic answer, right? But what I will tell you is this, as I think about industries across the country, there are so many industries that are grounded in centuries-long economic models that are asking exactly the question you've just asked. And I think it speaks to this core idea that this is not about training for a tool. It's about recognizing that there are fundamental assumptions about our economic development, our economic structures that are changing because of the tools themselves. I think the questions I would ask you are the following. One is, if we are really looking at, and I think over 10 to 20 years, and this is a provocative statement, meaningful mechanization and automation of our broad industrial base in this country, what is it that we are training our people to be doing in that world? I start from an outcomes perspective, right? What are the kinds of jobs that people are thinking about educational institutions as a training ground for, leaving aside the academic and intellectual frames, of course, that are parts of the mission? And what are the mechanisms by which we're going to be able to create that economic engine that says that the institution of higher education as it exists today needs to continue with the same economic modality it has? I think it's an existential question. I'm worried that we are going to do what we often do when faced with such questions, which is stay the course and hope that nothing will change too much. And yet I'm empowered because I see great conversations like this happening in this room and others where we're beginning to ask the right questions. I don't have any answers for you, but I do want to acknowledge two sets of questions. One I've spoken to already, which is, what are we actually training for? And the second is, what needs to change in the structure and hierarchy of the institutions themselves to be able to allow us to protect the core ideals of higher education, particularly those parts of the agenda that I know are part of the track today. Research, right, and ensuring that we're able to manage research functions as they potentially get decoupled from the training and educational functions that universities have played. And the second, to really think about how we change the economic model of funding the different elements of a university system, rather than having it all be driven by a combination of state, federal research grants and tuition. And are there ways that we build new multi-sectoral partnerships that allow you to drive different parts of the agenda using different financing mechanisms? I don't know if you have other thoughts. I know this is something you think about a lot.
Well, certainly lots of thoughts. I think the one thing that I'll share though is I think higher education institutions are becoming more and sometimes hyper aware of the budget as we've shifted from, at least at public institutions, from largely being publicly funded to being more tuition or outside funding supported. So I think that's made us more hyper aware of the activities that we engage in. And I think the overcorrection in that is somehow we choose to maybe only engage in the activities that somehow generate revenue. And I think the check that I would put on that is, do we still firmly hold true that if work is worth doing, then the money will find its way, right? And so if we can still be true to that we don't have to be driven by what can get funded, but what is worth doing, then hopefully the other structures in society will support that. And we may not see wholesale changes across institutions yet, but there are certainly pockets of innovation. Auburn, certainly I want to applaud the work that our units do at Auburn. We've got the McCrary Institute for Cybersecurity. We've got our RFID lab, the Biggio Center. Some of these centers are doing some really incredible work that are challenging what are those funding mechanisms, what are those, the thought leadership that's needed, and will the money flow after? And so I think from that perspective, I see some examples.
I love that. And if I can just follow up, I think one of the things that comes out of this, and your work, I think, is a perfectly good example of this, is the need for, as these conversations happen, for the institutions in this room to lean into the public advocacy that's attached to it. As we've thought about times of massive social transformation, we need idea creators and leaders, and then we need a number of other institutions to understand how important this is. In my world of philanthropy, I think this is critical, that philanthropic institutions need to recognize that the ways that we fund need to change. And often that change needs to be investing in the kind of risk-taking, new kinds of methods that will actually create, through many failures potentially, possible successes and thinking about what the evolution of these institutions need to look like. I think that role now sits with all of you to educate our lawmakers, educate our philanthropy and civil society institutions, and to share these practices with universities and colleges across the country.
Yeah, fantastic. So a couple of things. Thank you so much for the conversation. Hopefully you guys were able to find some nuggets to guide you through the rest of the day's conversations as well. Look forward to our continued collaboration. I think there's tremendous opportunity, and thank you for making the time to come to Auburn University and sharing those thoughts with us. For those of you that are in here, just a few quick notes. First, I want to go back. I want to apologize. I misspoke someone's name earlier. Andrew Elbrecht is the co-founder of AUBIX, and I'm just so grateful for the role that he's played in both the community as well as just today's event as well. Just some quick notes for what we're going to do today. There are 4 rooms, and they're all in this building where all of the events are happening. And you've got a workbook, our forever commitment to active and engaged learning here. You've got a workbook that you can use to guide yourself in terms of the engagements that we've got throughout the day. I want to recognize a couple of key things that are happening. First, I want to recognize my friend, Sheena, who's coming down she's the Assistant Vice President for Enrollment, Sheena Hardigan at a college in New Jersey. And they've been using just engagement with how do you reach more students more often when they're ready for the engagement. So I want to encourage you to engage with her and take a look at her session. At lunchtime, after we have enough time for people to grab their lunches, in a similar setup, we'll have Dr. Stephen Pruitt, who's the president of the SREB, the Southern Regional Education Board, as well as Lewis Stewart, who's the head of NVIDIA's strategic decisions. He is going to be in strategic partnerships. They're going to have a conversation, more focused around economic development and opportunity as well, particularly with higher education institutions. Encourage you to engage with that. And then we've got just an incredible slew we've got over 25 organizations represented on the agenda many from higher education institutions around the state. So I encourage you to engage and meet with each other for that. And thank you for making the time.